So thanks so much.
Good morning, everybody. All right, so we are going to talk about Microsoft 365. So there's some interesting parts about 365 that we feel like in our practice tend to be a little bit surprising, a little bit confusing, and some settings that we feel like people should be aware of. Before we really get started, I like to know sort of who's in the audience and who I'm talking to. I know this is the technical track, but I do want to get a feel for kind of who's in the audience for those that I can see. The old, like, raise your hand if feels like a real binary choice to me. So we're going to make it a little more complicated and confusing, which is the theme of the talk. So let's do thumbs up, yes, and thumbs down, no, and then it's complicated. Oh, sorry, let me grab the clear. So let's do yes, no, and it's complicated. And so let's see who's in the room. So who was born and raised here in Cayman? All right, so quite a bit. Yeah, I love that percentage. We've been on the island since Friday, and really only run into a few that I've actually met and gotten to speak to who are born and raised here. So fantastic. Thanks for being here. Thanks for welcoming us here to Cayman. It's been a real pleasure to be here. All right, let's get a feel for how the room breaks down, even though this is the technical track. Who's hands-on managing a 365 environment and is responsible, like hands-on keyboard settings? Yes, no, complicated, haven't figured it out yet. Okay, so some yeses, no's, good mixed crowd. Okay, who's indirectly responsible for 365 security? Maybe you run your organization's security program and someone on the team's 365, or you have a vendor who does it for you. But who's, again, if you're able, show of hands here or show fingers, thumbs, who's indirectly responsible for that security? And it's complicated. It's always complicated, isn't it? So that's a lot of complicated in there. All right. To go with the theme of surprising and complicated, a quick story about this thumbs up, thumbs down thing. So I think the movie Gladiator maybe popularized the thumbs up, this let them live kind of thing, thumbs down, kill the gladiator who lost in battle. Researchers actually think that the thumb represents a sword, and so this was kill the gladiator with the sword, so the opposite of what you would think. And they would hide their thumb like this to mean show mercy, spare the gladiator. So even something as simple that we take for granted of, yes, no, good, bad, has some history and some complication to it. And that sort of fits in the theme here of complicated or maybe surprising and less than straightforward settings in 365. All right, so what we're going to do primarily is we're going to go through 5 configuration options in 365. They're a little bit surprising, certainly counter to least privilege, and may not be what you want for your organization. Before we get into that, I do want to set the context and the scope a little bit. So I do want to hit 2 things. I want to put what I'm going to talk about in the context of your security program, where it fits into a more holistic security program, and then we'll get into sort of the size and scope of the issue that we're dealing with in terms of 365 configuration, and see where we go from there. First, a little bit, and this is not meant to pick on Fortinet, this is not meant to be a big FUD slide, this is just meant to point out that if you pay attention to some of the security news that's out there, you will pick up on loss of data, breaches, compromises that happen in 365 on a fairly regular basis and cost companies significant amounts of money. And so thinking that you as an organization can drop into 365 and start using the whole suite of apps and services without a significant amount of thought and forethought in security and configuration settings is a little naive, because bad things do happen. I was not able to attend the workshop yesterday morning, but for those who attended the workshop yesterday morning, there was a 365 kind of hacking and getting access to 365. So shout out to that. I heard it was fantastic, but certainly sheds more light on the fact that 365 is a common attack vector. All right, before we get into the rest of this, quick introduction, and thank you for the introduction before I started to speak. Doug Hislop, work for Soteria. We are a full-service cybersecurity firm out of Charleston, South Carolina. So I'm from the States. I'm joined here by Scott Thomas, who's also with Soteria. I'm primarily on the advisory, vCISO, and cloud security side. Scott manages our offensive security team, and we provide a whole host of services. Have a table out there if you want to talk to us. That'd be fantastic. I do scuba dive. I've got scuba diver up there just because it seemed pretty appropriate for Grand Cayman. So I was able to get, I think, 8 or 9 dives in since we landed to today. So we're doing pretty good. The weather did not prohibit what we were hoping to accomplish. I'm not a normal presenter. I don't do this like for a living. I don't go around. I don't do business development. But I looked up when I did my first security presentation, and honestly, it was so long ago I couldn't quite pin the date. But it was either 2000 or 2008, and it was about Unix security. So I'm not a natural presenter, but I do enjoy it and have done a couple. All right, so to put this in context, I thought it might be safe to talk about NIST since there is a bit of a NIST focus and presence here on the island. And so to put this in the NIST security program context, we're really here on the identify and protect side. This isn't like vulnerability management or pen testing and that offensive security. It's not really in that detect, even though we're going to talk about logging a little bit. This is a bit up front. Let's identify the scope and the context of what it is we're trying to protect, and then let's put pieces proactively in place to protect those. And so those fit in here. And straight from CSF, there's some implementation examples that talk about hardened baseline. So not to overdo the thumb thing, but let me poll the group a little bit for baselines. How many organizations that are represented in the room are pretty good about vulnerability scanning and patch management? Like, who's patching your stuff and keeping on top of vulnerabilities? Give us like a, yeah, where we sit with that? Yeah, hold them up. All right. So not bad. I mean, you're kind of in trouble if you're not covering some of the basics there, vulnerabilities and patches. How about secure baselines? Every time you roll a piece of equipment out into service and you go from provisioning to production, whether that's production on a user's lap or whether it's production in the cloud or a data center, you've got a secure baseline, a configuration you're applying that you know you have thought about and configured to meet your organizational security objectives. How many are doing baseline configuration? Okay, some thumbs up. Yeah, that's not bad. I mean, normally we find that ends up being like step 4 for orgs, but that's pretty good. Pretty good. All right, that's really the world that we're talking about. Is a lot of organizations are either thinking about moving into 365, much in the States for our environment have, or organizations are looking to retroactively configure and get serious about their 365 configuration. And so we think about this as secure configurations. And what we'll get to in a minute, what you'll see on some of the slides when we cover the items, is that we reference some CIS benchmarks. So CIS is a fantastic resource for security. All right, one more thumb thing. Who's heard of CIS and understand CIS benchmarks? Okay, fantastic CIS benchmark for 365. Most of the items we cover have a benchmark recommendation that associates with them, and so we'll take a look at them. And so that's where we are in the security program context and where all this fits in. All right, now the size and the scope of the problem. So this is not meant to be read. This is a bit of an eye chart, and it's on purpose. This, as of probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, was the list of apps and services in 365, just off the Microsoft Apps and Services page. And so some of the items on here are the big hitters like Exchange and Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, tons of functionality, lots of configurability. And then you have the entire Defender suite of everything, which is, if it's security related, it's called Defender now, and you've got this whole world of Defender that you're trying to set up and configure if you're in the 365 space. And so this is meant really just to represent that this is a large scope for organizations to try to cover. If you're using these tools and you haven't thought about the security configuration, there's a lot to cover and a lot of ground to make up. So fairly large problem. So now let's talk about, I don't think we coined the term or anything, but this pyramid of complexity, where what you have here is that bottom rung in the pyramid is the previous slide, just the scope of what it is that we're trying to get our arms around. And then for many of those, like Exchange Online, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, they've got a whole set of features that are built into that product. You've got a bunch of feature coverage. Many of those configurable by the end user because Microsoft caters to 5-people accounting firms and global companies, and they can't pre-configure everything right for everybody. So you've got this whole set of configuration. And then on top of that pyramid of complexity is anything that you don't fully understand or misunderstand, think you know, but you don't actually know. And all of these things combine into this fairly challenging problem of getting 365 security consistently right. Okay. Weird to stop in the middle, but I want to see if there are any questions because this is the pivot point in the conversation where we go to the actual settings. Any questions, any comments, any feedback? Last chance. Okay, here we go. So given the whole pyramid of complexity here, we're going to step through 5 surprising, counterintuitive, maybe weird configuration choices that Microsoft has made by default, what we think is wrong with those, what CIS thinks is wrong with those, and then what should be configured instead. So the first one here is a Entra ID, or what was Azure Active Directory tenant, which I think many people who haven't been in 365 for a while think of your Entra ID or Azure Active Directory as the thing in 365. Like that's the central corner piece, and there is one of those, and that's my tenant. The relationship's a little bit more complicated. I'm gonna be risky. I'm gonna go forward and then come back. So the relationship's a little more complicated. There is generally a one-for-one relationship between the Entra ID tenant and your subscription and a bunch of other information. And there is one relationship at a time, but that does not mean that you can't have additional or create new Entra ID tenants. And so back to the surprising point here, what this feature is normal users can create these tenants. So not only can you create additional Entra ID tenants, but non-privileged users can create those. Oh wow, sorry about that. So this relationship, while it is true and the Microsoft documentation is correct, there is actually a little bit more to it. So in the Entra ID portal, or in the Azure portal, you can create new tenants. The weird part here for us is that non-privileged users not only have access to the portal, that's kind of the weird side effect here, but in the portal they can create new tenants. In and of itself, that's not necessarily a huge problem. There's some really weird behavior that users can get involved with exporting and importing billing information and transferring some contact stuff. But it's not like creating a new tenant automatically means that the user who created the new tenant has control over your entire environment. They don't. But it is a little bit weird that normal non-privileged users can access the Azure portal and create new Entra ID tenants while they're there. And so that's any authenticated user. So an authenticated user in your environment, get in the portal, create a tenant. Now I have one, and again, it's not like a secret backdoor or anything, but there's some really weird behavior that they can then invoke with billing and subscription exports and imports, which can lead to eventually taking over billing. So that's weird. So what should be configured? Because that's a little bit surprising that Sue, I hope there's no Sues in the room because I'll probably say Sue a lot. Sue in accounting can create new tenants, which is weird. So what should be configured, and there is a setting for this, is that in your 365 configuration or in your Entra settings, you should go in and set it up so that that is restricted, that non-admin users cannot create these tenants. And so what that means is there's a tenant creator role and there's global admin. Most people are familiar with global admin. Most people haven't fooled with tenant creator. If you're in an organization where there are people who need to create Entra ID tenants, but they don't need to be global admin, you can assign them tenant creator role. And then those are the people who can create tenants once you flip the switch. We'll see it on the next slide. And so there's also something that you can configure that's a little bit too too left of field to cover in this talk, which is these Azure subscription policies. So because creating new tenants can lead to weird behavior about how subscriptions are managed and billing information is done, you can create subscription policies that restrict all that. So you get a little bit of a belt and suspenders approach where you can restrict who can create tenants, and you can restrict what happens with your subscriptions through policies, and we obviously recommend that you do both. So on some of these settings, there's going to be, we'll hit a screenshot here in a second, but there's also going to be PowerShell. So there's some PowerShell snippets where you can run this against your tenant with the appropriate privileges and essentially set this, flip this configuration setting to what we would expect would be normal and expected by organizations. So the PowerShell in the slides will show up in the shaded area. All right, and so here's the setting that is in the Entra Admin Center, which is restrict non-admin users from creating tenants. Unless you're in a really interesting situation, you do not want users creating these. So you might as well flip that switch. You're probably safe doing it. There is an associated benchmark. Here. So those familiar with the CIS benchmarks, they're essentially broken down into sections. The documents are very structured. So recommendation 523 here is that you want to restrict non-admin users from creating tenants and make sure that that is set to yes. So, and then finally, the impact of the change. We covered it a little bit. Once you flip that switch, then only people with global admin and only people with tenant creator, that group, that set of people, that's who can create these tenants. And we find that's almost exclusively what you want. Okay. There's one. All right, second one, Exchange Online PowerShell. So another one that's a little bit surprising and counterintuitive for least privilege is the fact that users, and all users, who have access to mailboxes, whether it's their mailbox, a mailbox they have delegated access to or audit access to, have the ability to access those mailboxes with Exchange Online PowerShell. So think of Exchange Online PowerShell as a very handy PowerShell module that allows the user to do pretty much anything they can do through an email client or through administrative panels. And so it's a significant way to automate access to mailboxes, whether that's configuration settings or sending emails, for example, or handling emails that are received through rules. It's an easy way to automate that. So what we find is attackers, standard business email compromise, you end up compromising a mailbox. What do you want to do? You want to move as quickly as possible. Most of them are smash and grab operations. And what you'd love to do is send out thousands of emails as fast as you can. And you'd like to put some rules in place to make sure that you're covering tracks a little bit and not being quite as visible to users as you would expect. And so now, because all users have, by default, access to their mailbox through Exchange Online PowerShell, me, the threat actor, can have a nice set of scripts that I'm running through and automating all of that work and moving through the environment very quickly. All right, so that is what's surprising here. Is the surprise, again, counter to least privilege is that assuming all users, Sue in accounting needs PowerShell access to her mailbox, which she doesn't, certainly counter to least privilege. And then it's the user's mailbox and any other mailbox that they have access to, again, through delegated rights or through audit capabilities. So tax surface, quick data exfil, convenient. It's not, Exchange Online PowerShell is not the only way to perform this, but it is a very convenient way, a simple way. And you might as well close the door to the Microsoft provided automation for dealing with mailboxes. And so you can do all the automated send. So what should be configured? There's a little bit of PowerShell here for this. There's two options, one for on-prem and cloud, one for cloud only. And this gives you the ability per mailbox. So this is, you can see it's based on setting the user configuration, but per mailbox turning off the capability to access the mailbox through Exchange Online PowerShell, which again is just most of the time what you're going to want. You can put users in groups. I mean, you can do all the normal kind of administrative shortcuts. So if you've got a group of users who need that access, you can segregate them in another group, plow through a whole set of other users. It'd be good to set this up in your user provisioning process. Make sure that you have all that set. All right, the CIS benchmark. If somebody knows better, we did not find one. We don't have a CIS benchmark related to this one. We feel like there should be one, and maybe there will be one in 3.2, but as of the 3.1 version, we're not seeing that. Again, this is not the only way to automate attack against BEC compromised mailboxes, but it's certainly a handy one that you'd want to shut down. All right, so when this change gets made, what happens is you've reduced your attack surface, and then only users who you have allowed it have access to their mailbox through Exchange Online, PowerShell. And then we would say that if you're in a particularly large organization where there's some automation going on and you've got some integrations built or something like that, you're going to want to take this change through a whole change management process and not just get the wild hair one night to shut it down on all mailboxes, because you could certainly break something. So definitely use your change management process, which I hope everyone has. Maybe. We're not going to do the thumb. Just think in your head, do I have a thumbs up for my change management? All right. Next one, enterprise applications. So, all right, we'll do the thumb thing one more time. I promise. Last time, I don't promise. How many people are very familiar with enterprise applications, how they work in 365, what the connection here is? All right, so, I'll explain a little bit of it. So, essentially in a cloud environment where you want to create these integrations, let's take something like Zoom. I want to give Zoom access to my calendar. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to consent through a process that's probably based on some standards, OAuth or other standards, and I'm going to consent. That application now has permissions that I've granted to read my mailbox or read my calendar and maybe put items on my calendar. So if I'm scheduling through Zoom, now it can reflect it on my calendar. It can see if my calendar is busy and allow somebody to book onto my calendar. It's what provides all that visibility. So that essentially is it. They can be more user-based, so a user granting access to their calendar. It certainly can be enterprise-based, where administrators are granting consent to enterprise features. Maybe like integrating Mimecast or Barracuda with your Exchange Online, and that's going to happen at an administrator level. But that essentially is the way that we're giving permissions in and out of tenants so that third-party applications or external applications can speak to each other. And so, and users can, for a set of these, users can provide that access. All right, so here's what happens when you're going through the consent. I'm reasonably sure all of us have seen these types of dialogues where I want to connect Zoom or I want to connect this best practices demo to something in my environment, or at least know who I am, and I get a pop-up that says, hey, you're going to allow this access to your environment. And then there's a bunch of let me zoom in a little bit. There's a bunch of little kind of points here that you would want to pay attention to when you're granting this consent. I have to be honest, when I put this slide in there, it reminded me of a phishing training slide, which phishing training is great, and everybody should do phishing training, but phishing training is not 100%, right? We still have a bunch of business email compromise because users click links, and getting users to understand all of the things that they want to pay attention to on a consent dialogue is maybe useful, but probably a bit futile. Right? You just don't want users granting access into your tenant that you're trying to manage, particularly for permissions that you're not interested in them granting. So while you can help users understand what they're doing, the best practice is not to do that. When users consent to dialogues like this, you end up with something in your 365 configuration, which is your application in your enterprise applications list. And here's a Microsoft example from some of their documentation. And so you can see that this has happened. You can see who has consented to what, but at that point, the horse has already left the barn, or whatever that saying is, and these are already configured in your environment. This is a great list to review periodically, just to kind of double check what's going on. But those are certainly applications already in the environment. So the surprising part is that here by default, users can just consent to stuff. Yeah, I can let this application read everything I have access to in SharePoint. I can let this application have access to all my Teams contacts, or my calendar, my email box, whatever that is. And so users who are maybe naively providing that consent, granting that access, are potentially allowing access into your tenant that you're not interested in. And then maybe this is super loose, but it's kind of the cloud equivalent of letting users install software on their desktop. It's just not the practice to do anymore. And so it certainly leads to data loss. Certain consent can enable the attacker to have a better foothold and bypass MFA, which you clearly don't want. MFA providing a significant amount of protection and coverage. So all right, the point here, granting users access to consent to these applications is just a bad idea. All right, so what should be configured? There's a couple things. Number one, Microsoft has created, and it's been in place for quite a while now, the entire admin consent workflow, which essentially is, I want the users to have the convenience of being able to request granting access, but I want to drop it into a workflow where administrators have to review and approve or deny that. And so that's all baked into 365. It's part of the administrator consent workflow, and it gives you the ability for, instead of creating tickets and tracking a bunch of stuff out of band, for users to be able to click through and then you're working those requests. So consenting, there's two sides to this. There's what the user capability is, and that's this screenshot here. And then next we'll pivot to what the administrator, the backend consent approval process looks like. On the front side, what you allow users to do is, instead of the default, which is allow users to consent for apps, which is just kind of everything, you can go 2 steps. You can go to a step that says, allow users to only consent to applications that are requesting a subset of permissions. Maybe read profile and maintain profile data, which really is just, I'm gonna let the app know who I am. Or for your organization, you might configure a few other permissions. But generally, that's a kind of high, depending on the org, maybe a high maintenance mode to do this. You've got to keep up with what permissions you've allowed, and then users are consenting to apps that you may or may not want, but maybe they fit the permission profile, so you allow it. Maybe not the optimal setting. I don't know why I have it picked here on the screenshot, but the other one is do not allow users to consent, which seems a little counterintuitive. You're saying don't allow them to consent, but I'm going to try to set up an admin approval process, so how do those play? And the admin approval process, which we'll see here in just a second, is that for any applications that a user does not have permission to consent, provide their own consent for, which would include that top option, you've essentially blocked it but allowed this backdoor, then they go into the admin consent workflow. So if you check the top box and say users can't consent, it means they can still get the dialogue, they can still press the button saying I want to consent, and it all drops into the admin consent workflow. And then there's a set of options, a screenshot at the end, what this looks like, but it's all baked into 365 and fairly convenient and understandable once you get it set up and have the consent workflow in place. All right, the CIS benchmark. There is a CIS benchmark for this and ensuring that that is enabled. We think there's 2 parts, right? You can enable it without restricting users, and you haven't really done anything because this only kicks in when the users can't do it themselves. You need to do both sides. You need to implement the consent workflow. You need to restrict what users can consent to. And those 2 things work hand in hand, which is kind of the 1-2 punch. We found clients that have configured one and not the other. They configure one and it bothers all their users. They configure the other and it actually doesn't do anything. And so you want to make sure you do both, even though the CIS benchmark really just talks about the consent workflow. All right, so when this happens, users get the dialogue, they press the button, it actually gives them a dialogue that says this has gone into your administrator team for some sort of approval. When administrators, approve it or deny it, all the communication happens, and Microsoft's built that out. So it works pretty well. And then, so the user's kept informed as to what their request status is. Okay, and then administrators are working that on the backside. If you've got a fairly large, busy, dynamic environment, you've got these requests coming in and you're working them through this consent request process, which is, again, baked in and pretty simple. All right, odd stop for questions again. Any questions, comments, feedback? Last call, number 3. All right, email forwarding rules. So users can consent to email forwarding. So what this allows the user to do is go in and create rules in their inbox that allows them to forward internally or externally. So any emails coming in or all emails coming in can be forwarded to an external mailbox. And by default, there's no exchange transport rules or limitations on mailboxes that prevent this from happening for users. And so by default, out of the box, even if you have secure defaults, you've got this capability. It can be useful. So to be fair, there are some organizations that need some mailboxes forwarding mail, and that can make sense. You just want to know which ones those are and which ones those aren't. So the interesting part here, the surprising part, is that there are really no restrictions in place by default. This can happen at multiple levels in multiple ways, and that standard users have the ability to do this inside and outside the organization. Super common attack path. We've worked IR cases where we're the MDR provider, and we'll get a BEC, we'll start to work it, and there's inbox rules that block all email or discard to delete all email from Soteria. So if we try to email the client or that client, then, and it's like, that's super weird, but obviously the attacker understands their environment, so these rules get used all the time. There's a kicker here. Let me, I think it's on this slide. So the bottom link here, maybe for time we'll speed up here, but this is maybe the interesting point, is not only can users set up inbox rules, but through certain techniques you can hide those rules so they're not evident when you're looking at the mailbox. So you can not only create hidden rules, you can create hidden folders. Compass Security is the group that kind of surfaced this maybe a year or so ago, 2 years ago. And we see this being used. So you get attackers creating mailbox rules and hiding them. We happen to have a blog post that kind of built off of what Compass Security put out there and provided some information in the community on how to detect those across your environment. It's probably a good scan to be doing. But all right, so back to email forwarding. The FBI has released and I realize we're not in an FBI territory here, but the FBI has released a private industry notification that essentially just tries to communicate to the entire industry. These are being used by attackers all the time. You want to shut this down. You want to prevent this everywhere you can and not assume that Sue in accounting needs to forward all her email out to a Gmail account. So what should be configured? There is no PowerShell that I have up on the slide for this. There's no screenshots because mail transport rules and other things can be a little bit of a knotty problem sometimes. It depends on what third-party pieces you have in place, if any. But here are three particular links to very useful resources and how to set this up in a way that gives you sort of multi-level coverage and not allowing emails to just be forwarded out of your environment. And then obviously this is another one for change management, which is if you have users who need the ability to forward, you need to pay attention to that and not break existing features and functionality in your environment. All right, so those are the useful links. CS benchmark, there is a benchmark for this, 621, which is ensure all forms of email forwarding are blocked or disabled, which is maybe a little cut and dry, a little binary there. You might want to, again, go through your change management, make sure that you're not breaking anything. And then the impact of the change, so when a user goes into their mailbox and sets up a rule, it seems to work fine, but then when an email comes in and gets forwarded, they actually get a non-deliverable on it, and they get a message back from Exchange Online that says that access was denied and you can't forward. So it's at least clear to them that what they tried to do is not allowed, and so they can either contact somebody for a legitimate reason or not, and give up on forwarding all their email to a Gmail account. All right, next one. Maybe the last one. No, I don't think it's the last one. All right, standard logs. So Microsoft did kind of the world and 365 users a favor last fall-ish. I think it was probably somewhere in that, fall of 2023, where you've got different levels of audit log capability. The level that you get for free and the level that you pay for. And the level that you pay for was way better. And so obviously Microsoft's trying to balance revenue and functionality, but given some of their recent security problems, recent in the last 20 years, but given their really recent security problems, they have, sorry, I'm not picking on them. We're a partner, I'm not trying to pick on them. So given some recent security problems in 365 and Azure in particular, they tried to do a little bit better for users, and what they did was they came out with some changes for the standard tier and the premium tier. So free tier included with your subscription, and then the high pay tier. And they closed that gap a little bit. They did it with retention. They went from a default or standard or maximum 90-day to 180-day retention, and then they added quite a big collection of standard log sources that are available in the free tier, the included tier now. And so they made that change. It was really good for the community, certainly for IR responders, forensics work, trying to figure out what happened in a cloud environment. People who are not paying for that premium tier are in a much better position. And so it certainly helps customers, and then gives you, so you drop into Purview, you do a bunch of searches, you just get a bunch more information now without having to pay an arm and a leg for it and go to like E5 licenses and a bunch of other stuff. All right, so here's what's surprising about that change is that they made this long list of log sources available, but they didn't enable all of them. They enabled a lot of them, and that was great, but they didn't enable all of them. And since Microsoft is footing the bill for compute and storage and everything else that comes to this, there's really no reason not to enable them all. We feel like you'd want to enable them all. Yeah, you get some noise, but search capability's fine, and noise is everywhere, and we've kind of learned how to deal with it. So it is a bit surprising that they're generally available but not enabled. There are some like mailbox items or mail items access and exchange send, which are now included in the free tier, and that's fantastic. But search query initiated exchange is not enabled by default. And what's one of the first things attackers do when they get a BEC is they start combing through what's in the mailbox, trying to find interesting information, and they do it with a bunch of search terms that are pretty recognizable and follow a pretty good pattern that you can pick up in MDR if you're looking at your 365 logs. But if you don't have it enabled, you don't have the visibility. So, and then here's the last surprising part is that to enable this, it is a mailbox by mailbox setting. You cannot go into your tenant level and just say, hey, I'm going to turn on these logs for my tenant. You have to go through mailbox by mailbox. And again, with Microsoft footing the bill on compute and storage, I'm not sure why you wouldn't. So what should be configured? Because this is mailbox by mailbox and you're trying to enable standard logs by name, and there's a giant list of standard logs, the PowerShell syntax is a little bit hairy because you're providing these arrays of log names per mailbox. So you're plowing through mailboxes and setting the setting. There is a link at the bottom, something else that we try to provide for the community. This is a GitHub link. So you can go out to GitHub. We've got some PowerShell out there. Allows you to do a couple things. It allows you to tie in with your provisioning process so that as new mailboxes get provisioned, runbook is executed and these settings get applied the way you want. And then there's also a kind of scan my tenant and find where I've got some gaps in my audit logging and set those for me. So instead of handcrafting a bunch of crazy PowerShell to get the setting you want across all your tenant, there's a GitHub resource there that's very handy for doing that. A GitHub screenshot. That's what it's going to look like when you go there and get the PowerShell. How about that? All right. So the CIS benchmark, this again is not maybe as granular as we would like. Maybe they updated in 3.2. Essentially is make sure this audit log search is enabled. That's a yes. You want to make sure audit log search is enabled. The flip side of that, the backside and maybe more confusing side, is you want to make sure you're getting all the material into audit logs you want, and that's where this surprise settings come from. All right, so you make this change and you get a lot more log visibility. You get, if you've got MDR tied into your 365 logs, you get detection capabilities and detection rules you can leverage now because of the new material in audit logs. And again, you're just riding on Microsoft Compute and Storage, so why wouldn't you? And then all of this is available through the normal Purview search capability. All right. That those are the last ones that I'm going to go through based on time. So here's some resources. The CIS benchmark for sure. It is 417 pages long, so there's a lot more surprises in there. If you've had the chance to go through it, it's actually very interesting to see some of the other things that are set up by default. The book on the left there is fantastic. It's a great resource for 365 security, so we definitely recommend that. CISA, which again is another US thing, but CISA's got great resources and some tooling built around 365. And then not a product pitch, this is free and available in GitHub. We have a GitHub project called 365 Inspect, which allows you to download, install, run against your tenant, and comes back with a whole set of findings, which all of these are in there, plus another 100 probably, that tell you, give you insight and advice on how to configure your environment. So that's a super handy tool, automated. You don't have to go a bunch of click ops through your 365 configuration trying to figure out where you line up. Sorry, I'm trying not to misspeak. So the open source version, those findings that are returned are now mapped to the CIS benchmark. So you get full alignment with the CIS benchmark and the recommendations we're providing. So you do get that in the open source tool today, which is fantastic. All right, questions, comments? I'm trying not to do a show of thumbs again. All right, last call, questions. All right. Yeah, she got the mic.
Hang on, I got a mic for you.
Make sure it shows up on the stream.
All right. Sir, could you name 2 worst case scenarios that the tenant would be able to do that the regular user has made?
So the new tenant really, it's primarily about billing and where subscriptions are associated with. So when a new tenant is created, I think it was on the slide, the user that creates it becomes global admin in that tenant. That does not mean that they have global admin capability over all of your resources, but they do have the ability to transfer, export, and import subscriptions and move some billing information. So that's probably worst case, is it's more of a nuisance and you're alerted to it and you find out about it, but a bit of a nuisance and problem there. I guess the other thing is for least privilege problems where you have something like this that doesn't have an immediate disaster scenario, but it's certainly not in alignment with least privilege. Our concern is what is that least privilege and this least privilege problem and how do those get combined by clever attackers to become a problem we're not aware of yet? And so that's a bit of the issue on that one is if you follow a least privilege approach rigorously, you essentially prevent a lot of things you don't know about yet and how these things can be used in combination with each other. So that's essentially why we would include that one in there. Yeah, you bet.
Else?
Last call. There we go. One over here. Two.
Well, I'll come running back that way. You guys are giving me a workout. Oh, where was it? I missed it. Oh, I'm on the wrong side completely. Who had the question? I apparently
There was one here on the left.
Ah, here we
I'm
go.
not sure about the back.
People in the back were trying to point to you, and I misunderstood that.
Good morning. This is a very basic question. I lost count of how many you highlighted, but is that where the ones that you listed, the benchmarks, is that the ones that you think that organizations should start their focus on? Or do you have like a top 10, a top 20?
That's a great question. So I would, if you're going to take a benchmark-oriented approach, I would tend to defer to how CI sets those up. So they set those up in levels. So most of their benchmarks have levels. The 365 Foundations has levels. And so they have level 1, level 2, and I think level 3 in the benchmark, in the foundations. And some of them relate to license levels. So some things you can't configure if you don't have the right license level, but all of the level 1s, I'm pretty sure, cover the kind of the baseline license level. And so I would start at level 1 and go across the board. The 5 here weren't necessarily for criticality. They just tended to be the ones that were kind of surprising and interesting, novel and weird, like creating tenants and just exchange PowerShell for SU and accounting. But I would look at all the level 1s across the benchmark first.
Thank you.
And there are quite a few. Okay, last call. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Doug.